So the activity that we just did, right? It was your grade, and some of you wouldn't even walk out with your grade. You can imagine that if you were a slave, that, you know, the penalty's even worse. And most of the time I have 8th graders who say, oh, I just leave. Well, it's not always just you can leave. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the slavery laws, the things that try to prevent slaves from just getting up and leaving, okay? And then I'm going to give you a scenario, and you're going to look at it, and we're going to talk about if you had this opportunity, would you leave, okay? And there's a lot more to it than you think, okay? So slavery in the 1600s and the 1800s. First slaves that came to America were actually kind of by accident, okay? Jamestown. They had indentured servants. What's the difference between an indentured servant and a slave?
An indentured servant gets, they work for a certain amount of time, like so that they can get a free passage to America.
They choose to do it.
Mm-hmm. And they can get out of it after a certain period of time without any restrictions.
Yeah. The first black individuals brought over to America on Jamestown, the first slaves, came over on a British ship. It was actually headed to the Bahamas for the sugar plantations. And if you were a slave, you certainly didn't want to be a part of the sugar plantations. They were rough. Okay? But they ran out of supplies, and they had to stop in Jamestown. And they had no money, so they traded the black individuals for goods. So now we have black individuals in a colony in the Americas. And they really didn't know what quite to do with them, and they made them indentured servants. So they actually worked for a period of time till that debt was paid off, and then they were given their own land. And some of them, by the time that they were free, slavery had been introduced. And some of them purchased some slaves to work on their land. So that wasn't, yeah. Now don't think that was used a lot, because it was not used a lot. But there are, if you check records in the 1600s, you're going to see some black individuals actually own some slaves. Because remember, it's all about money, right? It's all about getting the assistance you need to get your crops planted and harvested, okay? Not saying it's right, ever, okay? And I don't want you to think today that everyone beat their slaves, okay? Now, slave is a resource for you, right? You have to have them to get those crops in. It's like, and I hate this analogy because I hate comparing people to things, but if you go out and spend 40 grand on a new tractor, are you going to take a baseball bat to it? No, because that's a valuable piece of equipment, right? So your slave is a valuable piece of equipment, okay? The only time that you will maybe punish the individual is if they're doing something that is, you know, costing you money or causing problems on your plantation, okay? So the first recorded blatant, just total discrimination in the Americas that we know of happened in 1640. And we had 3 individuals who were indentured servants. There were 2 white guys and a black guy. And they promised, sign the contract, you pay my way to America and I will work for you for so many years. And then they got over here and they tried to run away and they were caught. Okay? The court system looked at them and they said, okay, to the 2 white guys, you go back, serve your time, and add 1 additional year. To the black individual, they said, you go back, serve your time, and you will never be free. Yeah. Not fair, is it?
Was that supposed to be life or live?
For life. He would serve for life. Okay? We already talked about this. This was an individual who was of African-American descent, from African descent, and he, once he was free, he went and purchased some slaves to work his plantation. You'll see this again. It'll be on the test. 1656. Elizabeth Keyes. Okay, Elizabeth Keyes' father was white, and her mother was black. Okay, and her father dies. Her father was a free white individual, but he had huge debt to this gentleman. And so the gentleman tells Elizabeth, "You can come and work for me as an indentured servant and pay off your father's debt." So Elizabeth, her dad is free, her dad is white, and she's a Christian. Okay? So 1656, on the books, on the law books, it said that children follow the bondage of their father. So if her dad was free, then she was free. Okay? Except the fact that she has to work to pay off her father's debt. So Elizabeth works, she pays off her father's debt, or so she thinks. And the guy says, I'm not letting you out. Nope, not going to do it. And so she actually takes him to court. Okay? And she says, the law says that children follow the bondage of their father. I have paid my father's debt. My father was white and my father was free. And I'm a Christian. Okay? How do you think the courts ruled?
They're like,
In her favor.
They did rule in her favor. They actually did. But this causes a problem in the 1600s. Why does it cause a problem now?
because there's a lot of them converted to Christianity, or they just stayed.
Yeah,
Did
we
it say that no Christians can be
enslaved for life.
enslaved?
So, well, people are going to try to get their Christian or their slaves to read the Bible because the Bible talks about obedience and following laws, right? So that's going to be a good thing. So most slaves are going to start going toward Christianity because their master has, encouraged them to go that way. Okay? Also, horrible thing. I hope you guys can handle this. Horrible, horrible, horrible. But sometimes the white masters would have kids with the black female slaves.
Yeah, a lot of them actually. There's
Yeah. Okay, so if your dad was the master of the plantation, but your mom was a slave, by law, you would be free. Okay, so now we have these slaves or these black individuals saying, wait, I'm a Christian and my dad's white. Guess what? I'm free, right? So what is the government going to do at this point? The House of Burgess and
They're gonna
yeah.
be like, no.
They're gonna be like, we let her get away with that, so we better do something real quick before we have problems. So in 1662, they say, nah, that's it. You children will follow the bondage of their mother. Okay? So if your mom is white and free, you're free.
They're also
Less likely to happen.
That is a lot less likely to happen.
There were actually a lot of mistresses that had affairs.
More the other way, but
Yeah, more the other way, but
okay? And then they're also going to say on the next slide that even though you're Christian, you can still be enslaved for life. We're happy that you're Christian, but you're still going to be a slave for life. So they just changed the laws. This is an interesting topic if you think about George Washington. Now, George Washington, 1662, George Washington time is during 1700s, right? But it's interesting because when George Washington is 10 years old, his father dies and he inherits some slaves. So George Washington thinks that, that's the way things are done, okay? By the time George Washington dies, he's changed his mind, okay? And he frees his slaves upon his death, okay? There's a problem, though.
How many of them actually went free because of their families were?
I'd have to look the number back up, but I think there was pushing 100, but I'd have to look it back
But their
up.
families were like.
Yeah, that's the problem. George Washington married very well. He married a widow lady who was very rich. Okay, her husband died and left her a fortune, and George Washington married her. She had several slaves. Okay, when they married, her slaves stayed with her family. His slaves stayed his. Okay, so they're both on the same farm. Now, if you're a plantation owner, do you want your slaves to mix?
no, because then they can share ideas. Couldn't they? They can share ideas, like.
That's a good point. They could share ideas,
They can make
but
more
think about it just a minute. Huh?
They can make more slaves.
They could make more slaves.
slaves.
Huh? Well, if your slaves, if a male slave and a female slave fall in love and have children, right, you're going to have more slaves because the father's a slave and the mother's a slave, right? Okay.
They're free.
Uh-huh. But if they mix too, I don't know about you, but if I'm single and I'm a slave, I'm trying to get out. Because if I get caught, the only person that gets beat is me. But if I'm married and I have kids, am I going to try to escape?
No.
Changes things, doesn't it? Okay.
Because you have to worry about your children.
Yeah. Well, George Washington, he had a situation whenever he died because, again, his mindset was changing. And so he freed his slaves. But his wife's family would not free their slaves. So George Washington's slaves go free. But they had married and had children with his wife's slaves. So it depends, right? If you were George Washington's slaves and you were female, your children were free with you. If you were George Washington's slaves and you were a guy,
Your children were still.
children were still slaves. See you later. Yeah. Good luck. Bye, sis. Right?
Where else did he go?
And so that's just what that talks about there.
It is horrible.
That is so weird.